Steve Harvey is one of those celebrities you've seen a million different times because he's achieved success in so many different areas. He started as a stand-up comedian and ended up branching off into TV, and you've probably seen him host a lot of his own shows as well as things like Family Feud and a number of other different endeavors. And he's also branched off into publishing and producing, and he is a very successful entrepreneur and TV personality. What interests me the most about Steve Harvey is actually his rags to riches story. So he actually struggled quite a bit up until the 1980s. For a number of years he was homeless, he was living out of his car, eating bologna sandwiches, and then finally he ended up getting his big break in the late 80s, and the rest is history. We know that Steve Harvey came from humble beginnings, but where did he really come from? Who were his ancestors? Where did they live, and what kind of lives did they have? I'm Yona Paley, and I believe genealogy is fun. Today, we're going to West Virginia and Alabama. Well, not really there, but we're going to check out their records so that we can do a deep dive on the Harvey family line. Before we begin, I want to show you about a new website I've created which can help researchers connect with their families. Kinsley is a social media website for genealogists. It allows you to create a page for your family, each of which has its own designated forum. The page then gets put into a searchable database so that users can find and join the groups they are interested in connecting with. The homepage contains a curated feed with all the specific groups and family members that you're a part of. That way you'll never miss an update and you can stay tuned into the findings and notifications of your family lines. As more members and families join the site, it becomes a powerful and simple tool for keeping track of your genealogical endeavors. Sign up today completely for free at kinsleyconnect.com/register. Let's get this family show on the road. Broderick Stephen Harvey was born 1957 in Welch, West Virginia, a small railroad and mining town which had a booming population in the first half of the 1900s and then ended up declining from the 1950s onward. And his parents were named Jesse Willard Harvey and Eloise Canner. Now, Jesse was from Alabama and Eloise was from Virginia, and Jesse worked for the United States Coal and Coke Company in West Virginia as a coal miner before relocating his family to Ohio shortly after Stephen was born. Now, according to Jesse and Eloise's 1936 marriage certificate, we can see that the town that Jesse came from was named Bessemer, Alabama, and his parents were called John and Clara Harvey. If we go back to the 1930, 1920, and 1910 U.S. federal censuses, we can find that John Harvey Jr. held many occupations. That of a coal miner, a metal worker, and a farm laborer. He and his wife Clara Simon had at least 9 children from the time they married in 1902 until the birth of the last son in 1919. Heading to the 1900 federal census, we find a 16-year-old John Jr. living with his parents, John Harvey and Harriet Robertson. And here's where things get interesting, because the parents are quite old, and the census mentions that Harriet had 11 children, 8 of whom are still alive in 1900. One household down on the page, we see another person named Owen Harvey, which immediately I kind of figured was probably a child of theirs, but we're going to learn more about him in just a moment. Of course, the 1890 census was destroyed in a fire, and so the next document that we have to learn about the family is the 1880 U.S. federal census, where we find John living with his first wife, Mary Ann. They have what looks to be either 2 daughters or 1 daughter and 1 granddaughter. Digging through the Hale County, Alabama records, I managed to find the 1884 marriage certificate for John and his second wife. John Harvey and Harriet West married in Alabama in 1884, and if we look really closely at the document, it shows some witnesses to the marriage, one of whom was named Caesar Tinker. And here is the magic of genealogy. If you go back to this 1880 census where you have John and his first wife living, if you go just one or two houses down the list, we see a woman named Harriet West living with her two children, Charles and Owen. And right next to her is a man named Caesar Tinker, just like the guy who was the witness in the marriage certificate. Owen West is roughly the same age as Owen Harvey on the 1900 census. So what it seems to be is that she had a child named Owen with a first husband, and then John adopted her kids, or at least one of her kids, and he then went under the name of Harvey. But there's actually a bigger mystery which I was not able to solve that I'd like to present to you folks. And if you think that maybe you can solve it or you have some ideas, let me know in the comment section below, because this one really confused me. The 1870 census shows John and Mary together, but with no children. And then when we skip ahead 5 pages in the census, we can find Harriet West once again living with a man named Owen Wells. And she has 2 children named Ailsie and Armstead. Ailsie seems to have been born around the same time as John's daughter Ailsie in the 1880 census. And yet she doesn't show up living with him in the 1870 census, which is very confusing, because given the same age and the same name and the fact that they're living right next to each other, it wouldn't surprise me if this was actually the same person. But then that begs the question of why on earth is she living with one of them in the 1870 census and then living with him in the 1880? So that makes me wonder if maybe John and Harriet had some sort of history before they got married in 1884. There's also the question of the fact that Harriet seems to have had 11 children by the time of the 1900 census. And if she had 11 children, but we're only seeing a few of them, and then she's also married to a guy named Owen Wells, not West, Wells, and he was 19 years old, which means that he might have had her second child, Armstead, but it's very unlikely Ailsie, because he would have been like 11 years old. So there seems to be something very interesting going on with the relationship between John and Marianne and John and Harriet. Going beyond the 1870 federal census for African Americans tends to be really difficult, because people who were enslaved tended to only be listed by their names starting in the 1870 census. Now, given all of that, I'm going to show you what I found, which may give some hints as to the past of John Harvey. First of all, it is 100% certain that John and Harriet were enslaved, because on their marriage certificate, it calls them both freed people. And I also managed to find the 1867 voter registration for John. So this probably would have been the first time he was registering to vote after voting was allowed for African Americans. Unfortunately, there didn't seem to be any online Freedmen's Bureau records for the county of Hale, Alabama, which was a little bit disappointing, because Freedmen's Bureau records can really give insights into the period after the Civil War ended, before the 1870 census. But what I did is a common thing that you should do, which is to look for people with the same name as an enslaved person pre-1870. And this is what I found. There was one slaveholder with the last name of Harvey living in that same county, and his name was John Gaylord Harvey. He was editor of the Alabama Beacon newspaper, and he owned 9 slaves in the 1860 slave schedules. So it's quite possible that he was the person who owned John Harvey. That being said, I always want to give caveats and arguments against that, because you never really know without having any proof or documentation. And the reason why I want to kind of give a counter to that is that John, because he was the editor of a newspaper, his name shows up on pretty much every front page of that paper. So it's still possible that John Harvey took his name because he was maybe a public figure, but I still think it's more likely than not. John G. and his wife died after emancipation, so even a look through their will and probate records didn't seem to yield any direct references to any of the people that they had owned. So unfortunately, wasn't able to find anything further on John Harvey and his family due to the fact that there aren't really any online records showing it. That being said, especially with Southern U.S. genealogy, a lot of times there are records in the physical courthouses in the areas that they were from. So if someone is from Hale, Alabama, and they want to go to the courthouses, there could be records still for this family. It's just after an exhaustive search online, where we hit the brick wall is with John Harvey Sr. And I think that's pretty good. So what do you think? Did I leave any stones unturned? Let me know in the comment section down below, and also be sure to follow me on social media. I've included links to my Instagram and my Twitter down below. If you like this episode, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the YouTube channel. As always, I'm looking forward to bringing you more videos, as well as tips and tricks that you can use in your own genealogy research. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.